Molly Hooper and Zeke Miller are in our Washington bureau. Molly is a Capitol Hill reporter for The Hill, and Zeke is a CBSN political contributor and a White House correspondent for Time. All right, welcome to you both. Let's start with who might be influencing the president's stance on foreign policy at this point. Molly, what do you think? Is this coming from the president himself?
You know, as he said in an interview earlier this week, his strategies are his own. When asked about Steve Bannon, sort of the man in the middle, so to speak, of this palace intrigue, President Trump basically said, I believe it was to the New York Post, that I think Steve is great, but, you know, I'm my own strategist. And he was, of course, referring to the campaign, but also in terms of whether he wants to, and he needs to keep Steve Bannon in his current position. One would look at, you know, people who are critical of what the president's doing in terms of, you know, the attack, or maybe not so much critical of the attack on Syria, but concerned about the movements towards North Korea and whatnot, would say that he's not fulfilling his campaign promise and being America first. But then you see the other folks who are saying, good, you know, America needs to be first, and President Trump is asserting that by these actions he's taking, and they sort of side more with the Jared Kushner, who just came back from a trip to Iraq and brokering this deal, or brokering the meeting with the Chinese.
Zeke, what do you think about it?
You know, I think it's important to remember that Donald Trump has flip-flopped before. He'll flip-flop again. You know, he's the first president who entered the White House without any career in the military or elective office. He doesn't have a whole lot of really ironclad beliefs. The campaign was sort of guided by these broad philosophical principles around vaguely nationalistic rhetoric. You know, things like, you know, the United States is being taken advantage of by other countries. Sort of these very vague principles that he's held for 30 years. And, you know, and then it's carried, you know, and we've seen that manifested in issues like immigration and a little bit on trade and economic issues, but more broadly on everything else, foreign policy and the like. He has, you know, he's flip-flopping all over these issues time and time and time again. You know, he was famously on all sides of the Iraq War. When you know, it's no surprise that, you know, when it came to Syria, he'd be, you know, there might not be a whole lot of consistency there. But this shift from sort of this wild foreign policy to sort of a more, you know, small C conservative Republican one, you know, can also be a sign that, you know, maybe it's a sign of the influence all of his advisors are having on him. He's now been briefed on all of the nation's secrets, and that might be having an effect.
Yeah, I mean, Molly, what about that? Because it's often said that these issues look vastly different from the Oval Office than they do from the campaign trail. I mean, could this be the influence of advisors like his national security advisor, H.R. McMaster? Now you've got folks who have real-world experience who are talking to the president about these issues, advising him on these very dicey foreign policy issues. Could that perhaps be a result of the president essentially expanding his circle of advisors?
Well, absolutely. And you know, what was striking was John McCain, Senator John McCain last week, before the president actually launched the Tomahawks at Syria, John McCain was on the phone with Donald Trump. Keep in mind, John McCain was not a big fan of Donald Trump on the campaign trail. Huge critic. Lindsey Graham, another individual, another, you know, former rival in the presidential campaign, also in the president's ear. They're sort of the cool cats on Capitol Hill. Right. You know, the cool Republicans, big C. And here they are, you know, saying this is the right thing to do, President Trump. This is the right thing. You've got the right instincts. And as we just heard, when it came to the attack in in Afghanistan today with the MOAB, basically Trump said, I've delegated that. Ultimately, yeah, sure, it was my decision, but my decision was to give that authority to the people in the field.
So, Zeke, what's the message here to members of Congress who are looking for where it is that this president falls on various ideological perspectives? You know, they obviously have their own views on these things, as Molly was just outlining. Senators Graham and McCain have been talking to the president about these things, and we've heard them very publicly, for instance, in the wake of the U.S. strike against Syria, praise the president's actions there. But if you're a member of Congress and you're looking for some kind of indication about where the president might be heading, what are you thinking right now?
I think the message, you know, the president put it best in his press conferences last week before he ordered those serious strikes, which was, you know, I'm flexible. And that's really the message to the lawmakers on Capitol Hill, particularly after the failure of the health care bill. We saw those, you know, those threats from Speaker Ryan saying, hey, if you don't come back and work with us, then the president might just cut deals with Democrats. And I think that's the White House is not initially was not sure they wanted to go in that direction. Certainly Steve Bannon was pushing them to sort of stay focused on the base, stay focused on that message. Keep working with the folks in the Freedom Caucus, try to find a Republican Party governing coalition. Donald Trump doesn't really think he can get that. He's a New York Democrat at heart. It seems like he might be moving in a different direction. So the message to Capitol Hill would be, let's find some areas of common ground. Let's try to make a deal.
And yet we've seen, Molly, when it comes to immigration, for instance, the Attorney General was out at the border talking about tougher immigration enforcement efforts. We've heard the president not really back away from any of the kinds of ideas, including a border wall. And in fact, there are reports, officials in the Department of Homeland Security are going to be issuing this sort of progress report talking about ways in which they can carry out essentially the president's campaign promise of cracking down on illegal immigration. So there seems to be some consistency there, Molly.
Absolutely. And that's actually one point that conservatives on Capitol Hill seem to be making. They really, President Trump, he ran on the border wall. People who went to those rallies, they wanted the wall. One of the first things that members of Congress, when I kind of ask about this flexibility on domestic issues and health care, well, they say, well, that kind of figures because, as Zeke was saying, he's a New York Democrat. He wants to get a deal, but he can't compromise on the wall because that's what everybody wants. And so what's going to be very interesting is seeing what happens in this upcoming sort of lead up to what could be a government shutdown in terms of so the spending bill for the rest of the fiscal year, which goes till September, basically, that funds the government. Because Republicans, well, at least conservatives who really back his immigration policy, want to have more funds in that bill for building the wall. And Democrats are saying, well, listen, if you put that money in there, we're not voting for it. And so that's where it's going to be really interesting to see what happens among Republicans up on Capitol Hill.
Yeah, I mean, Zeke, what do you think about that? Because the idea that some Republicans think about spending the enormous amount of money that it would take to, in fact, fund some of these proposals that have been outlined in these reports about the Department of Homeland Security wanting to, for instance, not just build the border wall, but also hire more Border Patrol agents. These are not inexpensive items. Could there potentially be some fighting going on within the Republican Party on Capitol Hill with those kind of proposals?
Oh, absolutely. There's really no way they can avoid these sorts of fights. I mean, their caucus is their conference is so massive and ideologically diverse at this point. I mean, there might be people in Republicans on Capitol Hill who'd be willing to accept a border wall even though they don't love it, but they don't want to cut funding to the State Department or to the EPA or other government agencies to pay for it. And then even some of the biggest proponents of the wall might not be willing. It might say, let's hold off another year because we can't pay for it, and they're deficit hawks. And then, as Molly was saying about the Democrats, they're looking around at politics nationally, seeing a surge in enthusiasm for Democrats nationwide, seeing their email lists and fundraise and small dollar donations so they're seeing the green. And just by being in the opposition to Donald Trump, there's really not a whole lot of incentive for them to reach across the aisle to him. He needs to the president needs to find a way to bring them over because there's really not a lot of reason for them to, from their perspective at least, they can just go let him fail.
Yeah, I mean, that was going to be my question, because the Democrats really have been hearing from their base that they should resist, right? This is the thing that we have been hearing from the Democratic, the left particularly, talking about whether it was Neil Gorsuch or a host of these other issues. They did not want to see Democrats deal and make a deal with President Trump, Molly.
Well, exactly. And the one thing about Democrats is that they could resist and they could fight back against Donald Trump. We haven't seen a lot of bipartisanship. And then when he launched that strike on, with those Tomahawk missiles in Syria, all of a sudden, for the first time in some 80 days, Democrats gave him praise. Yeah, I think Donald Trump actually, I think he kind of liked that, and was hoping that maybe, and I'm not in his mind here, but I would think he'd think, okay, well maybe I can start talking to some Democrats. Maybe they are more open to working with me. But when you hear, how but when the reports come out that he may try to use some budget tactics to deal with the Obamacare issue coming up and funding Obamacare initiatives and not funding them, they just don't like that. I mean, it turns them off immediately, and then they resist. And keep in mind, Donald Trump still wants to move $1 trillion infrastructure bill, but that may not come until after tax reform. And so the timing of all this is really important for him.
Yeah, Zeke, what about that? I mean, you know, it seems like an awfully ambitious agenda here, especially given what happened to healthcare the first time around for the president. I mean, is there a different approach here that you're hearing about from the White House?
You know, they haven't really gotten around to the tax reform question, talking to some folks over there. You know, it keeps slipping. Originally, it was going to be an April rollout. Now it seems to be sometime in May. You know, they're looking at this government shutdown deadline and trying to see what will it take to just keep the lights on April 29th. And once, you know, they're trying to put that puzzle together, and whichever way they can put that puzzle together, that I think will be the model that they'll use on tax reform, potentially infrastructure on the back end of that. You know, but you know, if it's Republicans, if it's finding some Democrats to, you know, to reach across the aisle, whatever it may be, that will be, you know, that will be the model for them to go forward. I think they're just, you know, all sitting in a bunch of rooms in the White House right now, looking at each other. And looking at all the options available to them and have no idea what's going to work yet.
It's a complicated puzzle, no?
It's so complicated, but it's so funny because you'll hear Donald Trump and he'll do these interviews with places, you know, publications like the Wall Street Journal, and he'll say, oh, you know, I think basically the way I'll get Democrats to come along with this plan is I'm just going to tack that on. I'm going to tack tax reform onto infrastructure so that they have to vote for it. Well, I'm like, wow, you're saying this to the Wall Street Journal. You're just giving away your whole tactic.
Right.
I don't know if they'll buy it.
Right.
And so
I thought he didn't telegraph what he was going to do.
Exactly.
Right.
But it's definitely entertaining to watch.
We'll see how the negotiation tactic works. Molly Hooper from The Hill and Zeke Miller, White House correspondent for Time. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.